Jake Morrison looked out the window of the small transport ship as it came down through the orange clouds. The planet below was mostly red rock and purple water. This was Zelthera, home to the aliens called the Kethvar. Jake was nervous, but tried not to show it. This was his first big mission as a diplomatic officer for Earth. "Remember, Jake," said Lisa Chen from the seat next to him. She was the team's expert on alien cultures. "The Kethvar care a lot about honor and fighting. They think warriors are the most important people in their society." Ben Rodriguez checked his weapon one more time. He was their security guard, a big man with kind eyes but strong hands. "I still think we should have brought more people," he said. "These aliens are supposed to be really good fighters." Jake shook his head. "No, a small team shows we trust them. We're here to make friends, not start a fight." The ship landed with a soft bump. Through the window, Jake could see tall figures waiting for them. The Kethvar were much bigger than humans. They had gray skin that looked like stone, and their arms were longer than human arms. Each one carried a sword that was as long as Jake was tall. "Here we go," Jake said, taking a deep breath. The door opened and hot air rushed in. It smelled like metal and something sharp that made Jake's nose wrinkle. The three humans walked down the ramp slowly. Jake tried to look confident even though his heart was beating fast. The biggest Kethvar stepped forward. This was clearly their leader. She was at least 8 feet tall with scars all over her arms and face. Her sword was covered in strange writing that seemed to glow in the orange sunlight. "I am War Chief Zarathul," she said in perfect English. Her voice was deep and rough like rocks grinding together. "You are the humans who wish to speak with us." Jake bowed the way Lisa had taught him. "Yes, I am Lieutenant Jake Morrison. This is Lisa Chen and Ben Rodriguez. We come from Earth to talk about trade and friendship between our peoples." Zarathul looked at them for a long moment. Her eyes were bright yellow and seemed to look right through Jake. "Trade," she said slowly. "You wish to exchange goods. But first, you must prove you are worthy of respect." "Of course," Jake said. "What do we need to do?" Other Kethvar had gathered around them now. Jake counted at least 50, all carrying swords. Some were almost as big as Zarathul, while others were smaller but still much bigger than any human. They all watched the visitors with curious but unfriendly eyes. "You will join us in the ritual of blades," Zarathul said. She pulled her huge sword from its place on her back. The metal caught the light and seemed to shine with its own fire. "Each visitor must show their skill with a blade. It is how we greet all who would be our friends." Jake felt his stomach drop. He looked at Lisa and Ben. Ben had some training with knives, but nothing like what these aliens used. Lisa was smart, but had never held a weapon in her life. Jake himself knew a little about sword fighting from his hobby back on Earth, but these aliens had been fighting for thousands of years. "I'm sorry," Jake said carefully, "but humans don't really use swords anymore. We have other ways of fighting. Could we perhaps show our respect in a different way?" The sound that came from the Kethvar was like a low growl. Zarathul's eyes grew darker, and she held her sword higher. The other warriors moved closer, their hands on their weapons. "You refuse the ritual of blades?" Zarathul asked. Her voice was now cold and dangerous. Jake realized he had made a terrible mistake. No, I didn't mean to refuse. I just meant that we might not be very good at it." "Cowards," said one of the other Kethvar, spitting on the ground near Jake's feet. "Weak," said another. Zarathul raised her hand, and all the other aliens became quiet. She looked at Jake with disgust. You come to our world asking for friendship, but you will not honor our ways. You say you do not use blades, which means you are either cowards or weaklings. Either way, you are not worthy to speak with the HFY. Please, Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. Let me explain. Humans have different customs. We can show our strength in other ways. There is only one way to show strength, Zarathul said. With blade in hand, facing your enemy with courage. You have shown neither courage nor honor today. Lisa stepped closer to Jake. Maybe we should try to find some middle ground, she whispered, but Zarathul had heard her. There is no middle ground in matters of honor, the war chief said. You have insulted the HFY people by refusing our sacred ritual. This insult must be answered. The alien warriors began to draw their swords. The sound of metal sliding against metal filled the air. Jake realized that things were about to get very bad very quickly. Wait, he said, holding up his hands. If I have insulted you, then I take full responsibility. What must I do to fix this mistake? Zarathul smiled, but it was not a kind smile. It showed teeth that were sharp like a shark's. You will face me in single combat, blade against blade, as our ancestors have done for 10,000 years. If you win, your insult is forgiven and we will talk about trade. If you lose, she shrugged. Well, dead cowards cannot make trade agreements. Ben stepped forward. I'll fight instead of Jake. I'm the security officer. No, Zarathul said, firmly. The one who gave the insult must be the one to answer for it. That is our law. Jake looked around at the circle of alien warriors. Their yellow eyes all watched him, waiting to see what he would do. He thought about the spaceship behind him. They could probably make it back to the ship and escape. But that would mean war between Earth and the HFY. These aliens controlled 3 star systems and had weapons that could destroy human colonies. If I refuse to fight, Jake asked, then we will consider it an act of war, Zarathul said simply. We will attack your people and drive them from our space. Many will die because of your cowardice. Jake closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he looked straight at Zarathul. Then I accept your challenge. The HFY warriors made sounds of surprise. They had clearly expected him to run, or beg for mercy. You will fight me? Zarathul asked. You, who says humans do not use blades, you will face the greatest warrior of the HFY in single combat? Yes, Jake said, even though his hands were shaking. I will fight you. Zarathul laughed, a sound like rocks falling down a mountain. Brave but foolish, little human. Very well. You have 3 days to prepare yourself. On the 4th day, when the sun reaches its highest point, we will meet in the arena. Choose your weapon and make peace with whatever gods you worship. You will need their help. She turned and walked away, followed by the other HFY warriors. Soon, Jake, Lisa, and Ben were alone next to their ship. Jake, Lisa said quietly, what have you done? Jake watched the aliens disappear into the distance. I've either saved our species or doomed us all, he said. I guess we'll find out in 3 days. Jake sat on his bed in the small room the HFY had given them. His head was in his hands, and he was trying not to think about dying in 3 days. The room was made of the same red stone as everything else on this planet. It was hot and smelled like metal. Lisa burst through the door holding a small computer. Her eyes were bright with excitement. "Jake, I think I found something important." Ben looked up from where he was cleaning his gun. "Please tell me it's a way to get us out of here without Jake getting killed." "Maybe," Lisa said, sitting down, next to Jake. "I've been studying the videos they gave us of HFY fighting. Look at this." She showed them the computer screen. On it, a HFY warrior was fighting with his sword. His movements were smooth and deadly, but Jake noticed something strange. "He's doing the same moves over and over," Jake said. "Exactly," Lisa said. "All of them do the same moves. Watch this video from 50 years ago." She showed them another video. The warrior in this one moved exactly like the first one. "And this one is from 200 years ago," Lisa said, showing them a third video. Again, the same movements, the same attacks, the same way of holding the sword. "They never change," Lisa said. "Their fighting style has been exactly the same for hundreds of years, maybe thousands." Ben frowned. "So, if it works, why change it?" "Because," Jake said slowly, understanding what Lisa meant, "if you always do the same thing, someone who knows different things can beat you." Lisa nodded. "Their fighting style is perfect for fighting other HFY, but it might not be perfect for fighting humans." Jake felt a small bit of hope for the first time since accepting the challenge. "Show me more videos." They spent the next hour watching HFY warriors fight. Every single one used the same basic moves. They held their swords the same way. They attacked from the same angles. They defended the same way. "It's like they're all following the same book," Jake said. "They probably are," Lisa said. "Their culture is all about tradition. They do things the way their ancestors did them. They think changing anything would be disrespectful." Ben was still confused. "But Jake, you don't know how to fight with a sword either." Jake smiled for the first time in hours. "Actually, I do." Both Lisa and Ben stared at him. "Remember how I told you I had hobbies back on Earth?" Jake said. "One of them was studying old fighting styles. I spent 5 years learning how people fought with swords in medieval times." "You never told us that," Ben said. "It never seemed important," Jake said. "It was just for fun. I learned German longsword fighting, Italian rapier work, and some English broadsword techniques. I even studied how Vikings fought." Lisa's eyes grew wide. "Jake, that's perfect. You know fighting styles that the HFY have never seen before?" "Maybe," Jake said. "But there's a big difference between practicing with friends in a gym and fighting an alien warrior who wants to kill me." "But you have a chance," Lisa said. "A real chance. These aliens have been fighting the same way for so long that they won't know how to handle something different." Over the next 2 days, Jake practiced every fighting technique he could remember. Ben helped by attacking him with a metal bar they found. It wasn't a real sword, but it was better than nothing. Jake practiced the German technique called half-swording, where you grab your sword by the blade to get more control. He practiced binding, where you catch your enemy's sword with yours and control it. He practiced strikes with the pommel of his sword and kicks that no honorable HFY would ever use. The key, Jake explained to Lisa and Ben as he practiced, is that human fighting evolved. We fought so many wars against so many different enemies that we had to keep changing our techniques. What worked against one enemy might not work against another. And the HFY never had to change, Lisa said. They were always the strongest, so their old ways always worked. Until now, Jake said. On the second day, some young HFY came to watch Jake practice. At first, they laughed at his strange movements, but as they watched longer, they became quiet. Jake was doing things they had never seen before. "Why does he hold his sword like that?" one young Kethvar asked his friend. "I don't know," the friend replied. "It looks wrong, but..." But what? "But when I try to imagine how I would attack him, I can't figure out how to get past his guard." Word spread among the Kethvar that the human was doing strange things with his practice sword. More and more came to watch. Some of the older warriors looked worried. That evening, a Kethvar named Thrak came to visit Jake. Thrak was old for his people, with gray scars covering his arms and a limp in his left leg. "Human," Thrak said, "I have come to warn you." "Warn me about what?" Jake asked. "Zarathul is the greatest warrior our people have ever produced," Thrak said. "She has fought in 100 battles and never lost. She has killed warriors from 6 different worlds. She is faster than a striking snake and stronger than a mountain bear." "I know," Jake said. "I'm not expecting this to be easy." Thrak studied Jake's face. "You are not afraid." "I'm terrified," Jake said honestly. "But I'm also ready." "I watched you practice today," Thrak said. "You fight like no one I have ever seen. Where did you learn these techniques?" Jake decided to be honest. "My people have fought many wars. We learned from each one. Every time we met a new enemy, we had to find new ways to fight." Thrak nodded slowly. "The Kethvar have always been the strongest. We never needed to change our ways." "That might be a problem for Zarathul," Jake said. "Yes," Thrak said quietly. "It might be." The old warrior turned to leave, then stopped. "Human, what is your name?" "Jake Morrison." "Jake Morrison," Thrak repeated. "I will remember this name. Win or lose tomorrow, you have already shown more courage than many warriors I have known." That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay on his bed thinking about everything he had learned. The Kethvar fighting style was powerful, but predictable. They always attacked high first, then low. They never used their hands for anything except holding their sword. They never used kicks or throws or any of the dirty fighting techniques that humans had developed. Jake thought about all the human warriors throughout history who had faced impossible odds. Knights facing Viking raiders, samurai fighting Mongol invaders, soldiers in trenches fighting with whatever weapons they could find. Humans had always been smaller and weaker than their enemies, but they had survived by being smarter, more creative, and more willing to adapt. "Tomorrow," Jake whispered to himself, "I fight for all of them." Outside his window, he could hear the Kethvar preparing the arena. Soon, thousands of alien warriors would gather to watch their champion kill a human. They expected it to be quick and easy. Jake smiled in the darkness. He had learned something in his 3 days on this planet. The Kethvar were proud of never changing their ways. But sometimes, the old ways weren't the best ways. Tomorrow he would show them what human adaptability could do. The night passed slowly, but finally morning came. Jake got dressed and picked up the sword the Kethvar had given him. It was heavier than the swords he was used to, but it felt good in his hands. Lisa and Ben waited for him outside his room. "Ready?" Lisa asked. Jake tested the weight of his sword one more time. "Ready?" Together, the 3 humans walked toward the arena, toward a fight that would decide the fate of 2 species. The arena was carved out of red rock and could hold thousands of Kethvar. As Jake walked down the stone steps, he saw that every seat was filled. The alien warriors sat in perfect silence, their yellow eyes all focused on him. The only sound was the wind blowing across the arena floor. Jake tried not to think about how small he looked compared to all these huge aliens. His hands were sweating, but he kept his grip steady on his sword. Lisa and Ben walked beside him until they reached the edge of the fighting area. "Remember what we talked about?" Lisa whispered. "Use techniques they've never seen before." And, "Don't try to be a hero," Ben added. "Just survive as long as you can." Jake nodded and stepped onto the sand of the arena floor. The sand was dark red, almost black. He wondered how much blood had been spilled here over the years. Drums began to beat from somewhere high above. The sound was deep and powerful, like thunder rolling across the mountains. The HFY in the crowd started chanting in their own language. Jake couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. They were calling for blood. A door opened on the other side of the arena, and Zarathul stepped out. Jake had thought she was big before, but here in the arena she looked like a giant. She was wearing armor made of black metal that covered her chest and arms. Her sword was even bigger than the one she had carried before. It was easily 6 feet long and covered in the same glowing writing. The crowd cheered as she walked to the center of the arena. She moved like a cat, smooth and deadly. Every step showed the confidence of someone who had never lost a fight. Jake walked to meet her. When he stopped, they were about 10 feet apart. This close, he could see the scars on her face more clearly. One ran from her left eye to her jaw, another crossed her forehead. These were not the scars of accidents. These were battle wounds from enemies who had tried and failed to kill her. "Last chance, human," Zarathul said. Her voice carried clearly across the arena. "Admit you are a coward and leave our world. We will think you weak, but we will let you live." Jake raised his sword. It felt heavy in his hands, but he tried to hold it like he knew what he was doing. "I'm not going anywhere." Zarathul smiled that sharp-toothed smile again. "Good. I was hoping you would say that." An old HFY stood up in the highest seat of the arena. Jake guessed this was some kind of judge or religious leader. The old alien spoke in the HFY language, then switched to English. "Let the ritual of blades begin. Fight with honor. Show no mercy. May the strongest warrior win." The drums stopped. The arena became completely silent. Zarathul raised her sword and moved into a fighting stance. Jake had seen this stance in the videos Lisa showed him. It was perfect form according to HFY tradition. Her feet were exactly the right distance apart. Her sword was held at exactly the right angle. Jake took his own stance. He used a German longsword guard called Fool's Guard, where the sword is held low and to the side. To the HFY, it probably looked like he didn't know what he was doing. "Begin!" the old HFY shouted. Zarathul attacked immediately. She moved faster than Jake had expected, crossing the distance between them in 2 quick steps. Her sword came down in a perfect overhead strike that would have split Jake's head in half. But Jake had been ready for this exact attack. He stepped to the side and brought his sword up to deflect hers. The 2 blades met with a loud crash that echoed through the arena. Zarathul quickly pulled back and attacked again. This time she struck from the left, then immediately followed with a thrust toward Jake's chest. Again, Jake managed to block both attacks, but he was already breathing hard. The crowd cheered as their champion pressed her attack. To them, it looked like she was dominating the fight. And in many ways, she was. She was faster and stronger than Jake. Her technique was flawless. If this had been another HFY warrior, the fight would already be over. But Jake wasn't fighting like a HFY warrior. When Zarathul attacked high, Jake ducked low and tried to grab her sword blade with his free hand. This was a technique called half-swording that German knights had used. Zarathul had never seen anything like it. She pulled back in confusion, not understanding why the human was trying to grab a sharp blade. Jake used her confusion to attack. Instead of swinging his sword, he stepped close and tried to hit her with the pommel of his sword. This was another German technique. The pommel was heavy metal that could crack skulls or break ribs. Zarathul barely managed to lean back in time. The pommel missed her face by inches. She looked shocked. In all her years of fighting, no one had ever tried to hit her with the handle of their sword. "What kind of fighting is this?" she demanded. Jake didn't answer. He was already moving, using a technique he had learned from studying Italian rapier fighting. He bound her sword with his, catching her blade against his guard and controlling it. Then he tried to kick her in the knee. Zarathul jumped back, her eyes wide with surprise. "You fight without honor!" "I fight to win," Jake said. The crowd was no longer cheering. They were murmuring in confusion. Their champion, who had never struggled against any opponent, was having trouble with a small human who fought in ways they didn't understand. Zarathul attacked again, but now she was angry. Her perfect form started to break down as she put more force behind her strikes. Her sword whistled through the air with deadly speed. Jake gave ground, backing up as she pressed forward. He was smaller and couldn't match her strength, but he could use techniques she had never seen before. When she thrust at his chest, he swept her blade aside with a movement from English broadsword fighting. When she cut at his legs, he jumped and brought his sword down in a technique borrowed from Viking warriors. None of his attacks were doing much damage through her armor, but they were frustrating her. She had expected to kill him quickly and easily. Instead, she was working harder than she had in any fight for years. "Stand still and fight properly," she shouted, making a wild swing that Jake barely avoided. "This is how humans fight," Jake replied, trying a binding technique that tangled their swords together. For a moment, they were locked blade to blade, pushing against each other. Zarathul was much stronger, but Jake was in a better position. He used a technique called winding to twist their swords around each other, trying to trap her blade. Zarathul had never seen anything like it. For a few seconds, she couldn't figure out how to free her sword. That was long enough for Jake to step on her foot and try to hit her with his elbow. She pulled back and finally freed her sword, but she was breathing hard now. Her perfect hair was messy with sweat. Her confident smile was gone. "Impossible," she muttered. "You should be dead by now." Jake was also tired, but he felt a growing confidence. His techniques were working. She was faster and stronger, but she didn't know how to deal with his fighting style. "Your people have fought the same way for thousands of years," Jake said, circling her slowly. "But humans have fought thousands of different wars. We learned something new from each one." Zarathul's eyes narrowed. She was beginning to understand that this human was more dangerous than she had thought. His small size and strange techniques were making him very hard to kill. She took a deep breath and raised her sword again. This time she would not underestimate him. The fight was only half over, but already Jake had done something no one had expected. He had made the greatest warrior of the Kethvar look uncertain. In the crowd, old Thrak leaned forward in his seat. He had lived long enough to see many battles, but he had never seen anything like this. The human was using techniques that made no sense according to Kethvar tradition, but somehow they were working. "Clever little warrior," Thrak whispered to himself. "Let's see what else you can do." Zarathul wiped sweat from her forehead and stared at Jake with new respect. This human had lasted longer than any opponent she had faced in the past 20 years. Worse, he was using fighting techniques that made no sense to her. "You cannot win," she said, but her voice was not as confident as before. "I am stronger and faster than you." Jake moved his sword to a new position, this time using a stance from medieval Italian fighting. "Maybe, but strength isn't everything." The crowd had grown completely silent. They had come expecting to watch their champion quickly kill a weak human. Instead, they were watching their greatest warrior struggle against techniques they had never imagined. Zarathul attacked again, but this time Jake was ready. He had been watching her patterns, learning how she moved. When she struck high, he didn't just block. He caught her sword with his and used a German technique called Mutieren to slide his blade down hers and strike at her hands. She pulled back just in time, but the move left her off balance. Jake immediately followed up with a thrust toward her armpit, where her armor didn't cover. She had to twist awkwardly to avoid the strike. "How do you know to attack there?" she demanded. "Armor has weak spots," Jake said. Human knights figured that out a long time ago. Jake had studied medieval fighting for years, and one thing he had learned was that armor was never perfect. There were always gaps at the joints where an enemy could strike. The HFY had never needed to worry about this because they all fought the same way. They attacked the same targets with the same techniques, but Jake knew dozens of different ways to attack an armored opponent. When Zarathul tried her favorite overhead strike again, Jake didn't block it normally. Instead, he used both hands on his sword and caught her blade in a bind, then twisted his sword around hers in a complex movement that ended with him controlling both weapons. For a terrifying moment, Zarathul found herself unable to move her sword. Jake had wrapped their blades together in a way she didn't understand. She tried to pull free, but every movement she made only made the bind tighter. Panic flickered in her yellow eyes. In all her years of fighting, no one had ever completely controlled her weapon like this. Jake could see her fear, and he pressed his advantage. While their swords were locked together, he stepped close and tried to grab her sword hand. If he could control her weapon and her sword arm, the fight would be over. But Zarathul was not the greatest HFY warrior for nothing. She let go of her sword with one hand and punched Jake in the ribs. The blow sent him staggering backward, breaking the bind. Jake felt like he had been hit by a sledgehammer. His ribs screamed with pain, and he could taste blood in his mouth. But he was still standing, and he still had his sword. Zarathul picked up her weapon and looked at Jake with something that might have been admiration. "You fight well for such a small creature." "I'm not done yet," Jake gasped, trying to ignore the pain in his side. This time, when Zarathul attacked, she was more careful. She had learned to respect Jake's strange techniques. But that caution worked against her. The HFY fighting style was built around aggressive, overwhelming attacks. When she held back, she was not using her greatest strengths. Jake saw the change in her fighting and adapted immediately. This was what humans did best. They watched, they learned, and they changed their approach based on what they saw. He started using more defensive techniques, letting her attack and then countering, in ways she couldn't predict. When she thrust at his chest, he deflected her blade and immediately grabbed it with his free hand, using a technique called half-swording to control her weapon while striking at her with his pommel. When she tried to cut at his legs, he jumped over her blade and came down with a strike aimed at her wrist. When she attacked from the left, he stepped to the right and used a Viking technique to hook her sword with his crossguard. Each technique was different. Each one came from a different time and place in human history, and each one was something the HFY had never seen before. The crowd began to murmur. Some of the younger warriors were pointing at Jake's movements and whispering to each other. They were trying to understand how he was doing what he was doing. His technique makes no sense, one young Kethvar said to his friend. But it's working, his friend replied. Look at Zarathul. She's confused. And she was confused. For the first time in her long career as a warrior, Zarathul was fighting someone whose moves she couldn't predict. Every time she thought she understood what Jake was doing, he would switch to a completely different style. Jake was fighting like 5 different warriors at once. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This human wasn't just using one fighting style. He was mixing techniques from many different styles, switching between them faster than she could adapt. Impossible, she breathed. No one can master so many different ways of fighting. Humans can, Jake said. We've had to. Jake's next attack came from a Japanese sword technique he had studied. He feinted high, then cut low in a movement designed to get under an opponent's guard. Zarathul tried to block, but she was expecting a European-style attack. The Japanese technique came from a completely different angle. Her block was too slow. Jake's sword slipped past her guard and cut across her thigh, just below the edge of her armor. It was the first real hit of the fight. Purple blood flowed down her leg, and Zarathul staggered backward. She looked down at the wound in shock. No one had drawn her blood in combat for over 30 years. The crowd erupted in amazed shouts. Their champion was bleeding. The small human had actually hurt the greatest warrior of the Kethvar. Jake didn't celebrate. He knew the wound wasn't serious, and an injured Zarathul might be even more dangerous than a healthy one. But he had proved something important. She could be hurt. She could be beaten. Zarathul looked up from her wound and met Jake's eyes. What he saw there was no longer contempt or amusement. It was respect. "You are a true warrior," she said quietly. "I was wrong to call you a coward." "And you're the best fighter I've ever faced," Jake replied honestly. Zarathul nodded once, then raised her sword again. "Then let us finish this with honor." But Jake could see that something had changed in her. The casual confidence was gone. She was taking him seriously now, fighting with the full focus she would give to any dangerous enemy. The problem was, Jake was getting tired. His ribs still hurt from her punch, and his arms were getting heavy from wielding the big Kethvar sword. She was stronger than him and could fight longer than him. He needed to end this soon, or she would wear him down and kill him. Jake thought about all the techniques he hadn't used yet. There was one move he had been saving, something so unusual, that even he wasn't sure it would work. It was time to find out. He shifted his grip on his sword and moved into a fighting stance that no Kethvar had ever seen before. It was called Mordhau, a German technique where the fighter held the sword by its blade and used the heavy crossguard and pommel as a warhammer. Zarathul had never seen anything like it. Jake was holding his sword backward, gripping the sharp blade with both hands. It looked insane. "What are you doing?" she asked. Jake smiled grimly. "Something my ancestors taught me." Then he attacked. Jake charged forward, holding his sword by the blade, using the heavy metal crossguard like a hammer. This was the most unusual technique in his arsenal. Something medieval German knights had used when fighting heavily armored opponents. Zarathul tried to block with her sword, but she didn't know how to defend against this strange attack. The crossguard of Jake's sword crashed into her blade with tremendous force, and the impact was so different from normal sword fighting that it threw off her balance. Before she could recover, Jake spun the sword in his hands and struck at her, shoulder with the pommel. The heavy metal ball at the end of his sword's handle hit her armor with a loud clang. The blow didn't penetrate her armor, but it hit so hard that she staggered sideways. For a moment, her sword arm went numb from the shock. Jake immediately switched back to holding his sword normally and attacked her injured leg. She tried to parry, but her sword arm was still weak from the pommel strike. His blade slipped past her defense and cut across the same wound he had made before. This time, the cut was deeper. Purple blood flowed freely down her leg, and Zarathul dropped to one knee. The arena was completely silent. No one could believe what they were seeing. Their greatest champion was on the ground, beaten by a human half her size. But Jake made a mistake. Instead of pressing his attack and finishing the fight, he stepped back. He was breathing hard and wanted a moment to rest. More importantly, something inside him didn't want to kill this brave warrior who had fought with such skill and honor. Zarathul saw his hesitation and used it. With a roar of anger and desperation, she lunged forward from her kneeling position and grabbed a fallen sword that another warrior had dropped earlier. Now she had two weapons. She swung both swords at once, one high and one low. Jake barely managed to block the high attack, and the low sword cut across his leg. Now both fighters were bleeding. "I will not lose to a human," Zarathul shouted, attacking with both swords in a fury of strikes. Jake gave ground, unable to block both weapons at once. One sword cut his arm, another struck his shoulder. He was being overwhelmed by her desperate assault. But then Jake remembered something his old sword instructor had taught him. When your enemy gets angry, they make mistakes. And Zarathul was making mistakes. In her rage, she was abandoning all technique and just trying to hit him as many times as possible. Her attacks were wild and uncontrolled. Jake waited for his chance. When she overextended with both swords, leaving herself open, he stepped inside her guard and grabbed her sword hand. Using a wrestling technique, he twisted her wrist and forced her to drop one of her weapons. Then he used a move called winding to wrap his sword around her remaining blade and trap it. With both their swords locked together, he stepped close and put his free hand on her throat. "Yield," he said quietly. Zarathul looked into his eyes. She could see that he had won. With her sword trapped and his hand at her throat, she was completely helpless. He could kill her easily. But he was giving her a chance to surrender. For a long moment they stood frozen like that. The entire arena held its breath. Then Zarathul did something unexpected. She smiled. "You could kill me," she said. "Yes," Jake replied, "but you choose not to. Killing you won't make our peoples friends." Zarathul nodded slowly. She opened her hand and let her sword fall to the sand. The crowd erupted in shocked shouts. Their champion had surrendered. It was something that had never happened before in the history of the Kethvar. Jake released her throat and stepped back. He was swaying on his feet from exhaustion and blood loss, but he was alive. More importantly, he had won without killing anyone. Zarathul slowly got to her feet. She looked around at the shocked faces of her people, then back at Jake. "I yield the fight to Jake Morrison of Earth," she announced in a voice that carried across the entire arena. But instead of walking away, she did something that surprised everyone. She picked up one of the fallen swords and pointed it at Jake. Jake tensed, thinking she was going to attack again. But there was no anger in her eyes now. Only curiosity. "Any last words?" she asked, holding the sword steady. Jake looked at the weapon in her hands and started to smile. After everything they had been through, after all the techniques he had shown her, she was still holding the sword wrong. Yeah, he said, his smile growing wider. You're holding it wrong. Zarathul looked down at her sword in confusion. What do you mean? Jake stepped closer, no longer afraid. Your grip is too tight and your hands are too close together. Here, let me show you. He gently adjusted her hands on the sword handle, moving them to the proper positions. See? This gives you better control and more power in your strikes. Zarathul tested the new grip, making a few practice swings. Her eyes widened as she felt the difference. This feels better, she admitted. Your fighting style is perfect for fighting other Kethvar, Jake explained. But there are other techniques that might work even better. Different situations call for different approaches. Show me, Zarathul said immediately. Over the next hour, as medics treated their wounds, Jake demonstrated some of the techniques he had used in their fight. He showed her the proper way to bind an opponent's weapon, how to use the pommel as a striking tool, and why holding the sword by the blade could sometimes be useful. Zarathul learned quickly. She was a natural warrior, and once she understood the principles behind Jake's techniques, she could adapt them to her own style. Amazing, she said, after trying a half-sorting technique. In 300 years of fighting, I never thought to hold a sword this way. Your ancestors developed a perfect fighting system, Jake said. But perfection can be a trap. When you stop learning new things, you stop growing stronger. The crowd watched in fascination as their greatest warrior learned from the human she had tried to kill. Many of the younger Kethvar came down to the arena floor to see these new techniques for themselves. Old Thrak approached them, limping on his wounded leg but smiling widely. Jake Morrison, he said, you have done something remarkable today. I just tried not to die, Jake replied. No, Thrak said. You showed us that strength comes in many forms. We Kethvar have always believed that tradition was more important than innovation, but you have proved that those who stop learning become weak. Zarathul nodded in agreement. I have been the greatest warrior of our people for 50 years, but today, a human half my size taught me that I still have much to learn. She turned to face the crowd of Kethvar warriors who had gathered around them. Listen to me, she called out. This human has shown us something important. We have fought the same way for thousands of years because it always worked. But Jake Morrison used techniques from many different fighting traditions. He adapted and changed his approach based on what he saw. That is why he was able to defeat me. The crowd murmured in amazement. Their champion was praising the human who had beaten her. I propose an alliance between our peoples, Zarathul continued, but not just for trade. I want to learn these human fighting techniques, and perhaps we can teach them some of our traditions in return. Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. Not only had he survived the fight, but he had actually accomplished what he came here to do. Earth would have an alliance with the Kethvar. Over the following days, Jake worked with Zarathul and other Kethvar warriors to establish a cultural exchange program. Human martial arts instructors would come to Zelthara to teach historical fighting techniques. In return, Kethvar masters would visit Earth to share their own warrior traditions. You know, Lisa said as they prepared to leave the planet, when you accepted that challenge, I thought you were crazy. I was crazy, Jake admitted, but sometimes crazy is the only way to solve an impossible problem. Ben laughed. Well, it worked. Earth's first alien allies are going to be warrior poets who love sword fighting. Could be worse. As their ship prepared to leave Zelthara, Zarathul came to see them off. The proud warrior who had once wanted to killed Jake now considered him a friend and teacher. "When will you return?" she asked. "Soon," Jake promised. "There's a lot more I can teach you, and I have a feeling there's a lot you can teach me, too." Zarathul smiled and drew her sword. But this time she held it the way Jake had shown her, with the proper grip and stance that would give her maximum control and power. "Next time we fight," she said, "it will be much more interesting." Jake laughed. "I'm looking forward to it." As their ship lifted off from the red planet, Jake looked down at the arena where he had nearly died. But instead of fear, he felt pride. He had taken the greatest risk of his life and turned it into the greatest victory. Humans were smaller and weaker than most of the alien species they had encountered. But they had something that pure strength couldn't match: the ability to learn, adapt, and find new solutions to old problems. And sometimes that was enough to change the galaxy. The alliance between Earth and the Kethavar would become one of the strongest in known space. It started with a sword fight, but it grew into something much more important: a friendship between two warrior cultures who learned that strength comes not from never changing, but from never stopping to learn. And it all began because a human diplomat was brave enough to admit that he was holding his sword wrong, and wise enough to show someone else how to hold it right.